Glossary. Absolute pitch, AP. The ability to identify or produce the pitch of a musical note without any external reference, also called perfect pitch. Action potential. Transmission of an electrical signal from the cell body of a neuron along the axon to the presynaptic terminal, resulting in the release of neurotransmitter. Adaptation. An evolved solution to a problem of survival and reproduction. Adaptive specialization. The relative ease with which animals acquire certain associations based on their evolutionary history. Affordance learning. A social learning process in which observers learn the properties of objects or relationships between objects. Algorithm. A specific procedure or set of instructions that will yield the correct solution. Analog magnitude representation. A noisy representation of a set of items that is proportional to the number of items being represented. Aposematism. A form of passive communication in which an unpalatable species has coloration, odors, or warning sounds that signal danger, e.g. toxic or causing illness, to potential predators. Arbitrary causality. A relationship in which the generative processes of the causal interaction are not readily apparent, e.g. pecking a key causes food to appear, see natural causality for contrast. Attention. The mental process that selects sensory information for further processing, of focusing on a particular stimulus or event. Audience effect. Occurs when signaling behavior is altered by the presence or absence of receivers, as well as the receiver's response. Autism spectrum disorders. Developmental disorders characterized by communicative and social deficits, among others. Automatic imitation. A process describing how humans will learn the actions of others without any conscious intention to imitate or awareness that they have learned from others. Availability heuristic. A cognitive bias to judge more memorable events as occurring at higher frequencies. Axon. Output fiber of a neuron that ends in presynaptic terminals. Bayesian mimicry. Describes instances in which a palatable species has similar physical features to an aposematic species, in essence dishonestly using another species' honest warning signal. Bayesian inference. A form of inference that considers prior probabilities and updates based on new observations. Beacon. A stimulus that marks a goal location. Behavioral ecology. An offshoot field of ethology that is characterized by increased attention to the ultimate causes of behavior, the scientific study of interactions between organisms and their environment, and how these interactions result in differential survival and reproduction. Behavioral economics. A field merging behavioral analysis of choice with economics, a description of choice behavior in terms of costs and gains. Behavioral neuroscience. The study of brain-behavior relationships in all animals. Behaviorism. A subdiscipline of psychology associated with John B. Watson that adheres to the principle that behavior, not thoughts or ideas or any other cognitive process, is the only justifiable object of study in psychology. Bias. In choice experiments, preference for one behavioral option that is independent of reinforcement payoff. Bidirectional control procedure. A procedure used to study social learning in which an observer watches a demonstrator move an object in one of two possible directions to obtain a goal. Binocular vision. Overlap of the two visual fields so that visual information reaching the two eyes is similar. Biological motion. The movement of animals, particularly vertebrates, is in most cases non-rigid, yet it is constrained by the configuration of the body and gravity. Bioluminescence. Chemical light produced when organic compounds are mixed occurs in the organs of deep-sea animals. Blind sight. A phenomenon in which individuals with cortical blindness are able to locate a visual stimulus, residual visual function with no awareness of this function. Blocking. A phenomenon in which an association between one stimulus and a US disrupts subsequent conditioning to a second stimulus when the two are presented in compound conditioning trials. Camouflage, structural adaptations that allow a species to blend in with its environment. Categorization, the cognitive process of classifying items or events into groups based on one or more common features. Category-specific semantic deficit, the inability to access information about one semantic category while leaving others intact. Causal Bayes nets. Causal structures of the world are depicted with graphical models that formalize inferences based on conditional probabilities and consequences of interventions. Central place forager, an animal that carries food back to a home base, such as a nest or burrow, to hoard or consume it. Chameleon effect, a term used to describe the finding that humans have a propensity to unknowingly mimic body movements of people they interact with. Choice, the outcome of decision-making, measured as a motor action or verbal response. Chunking, a process that increases encoding capacity by reorganizing discrete elements of sensory input into larger units. Chunks. Circadian rhythm, a rhythm of activity or physiological state that appears to be the result of an internal clock with an approximately 24-hour cycle. Classical conditioning, a type of non-declarative memory, the process whereby stimuli that do not elicit a response initially acquire this ability through association with a motivationally significant event. Cognition, knowledge or thinking, the acquisition, storage, and processing of mental information in humans and animals. Common adaptation, a process whereby individual species develop different strategies for dealing with the same problem, convergence on the same solution through independent evolutionary change, like for example food gathering. Compensatory plasticity hypothesis, the idea that a loss or deficit in one sense leads to a heightened capacity in another. Computer science, a branch of science that deals with the design of computers and theories of computation. Concept, the abstract set of rules that define membership in a category. Concept formation, the cognitive process of establishing and updating the abstract set of rules for category membership. Concurrent schedule of reinforcement, operant conditioning in which two or more schedules of reinforcement are in effect simultaneously. Conditioned avoidance, an operant paradigm in which animals learn to avoid a stimulus associated with an aversive event. Conditioned response, CR, in classical conditioning, a response that is elicited by the conditioned stimulus following conditioning. Conditioned stimulus, CS, in classical conditioning, a stimulus that acquires motivational significance through pairing with the unconditioned stimulus. Conditioned taste aversion, CTA, an aversive reaction to the smell and taste of a particular food caused by a prior food nausea association. Conformity, basing one's behavior on the behavior of the majority of individuals in one's group. Con-learn, a proposed visual system that allows for further learning about the facial characteristics of conspecifics. Consolidation, the second stage of memory processing, in which encoded representations are modified to become more stable over time. Conspec, a proposed visual system that orients the newborn to face-like patterns. Conspecific recognition, a form of social categorization that involves recognition by one member of a species of another member of the same species, intra-species recognition. Contagion, a term used to describe reflexive, species-typical, matching responses to the behavior of others. Continuity hypothesis, the idea that trait differences between animals and humans will be quantitative, not qualitative, of a different order only. Continuous reinforcement, CRF, a reinforcement schedule in which every response produces a reinforcer, equivalent to an FR1 schedule. Cooperative breeding, situations in which individuals, who are not parents themselves, are actively engaged in raising others' offspring. Dark adaptation, a reduction in the threshold for detecting light that occurs under reduced illumination. Decision-making, the cognitive process of selecting one course of action from a variety of options. Declarative memory, a subcategory of reference memory, a knowledge-based system that is expressed through explicit statements and depends on conscious awareness. Delayed discounting, see temporal discounting. Dendrites, tiny fibers that branch from the cell body of neurons. Synaptic receptors, located along dendritic surfaces, allow chemical signals to be received from other neurons. Devaluation, a three-stage experiment. 1. Conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus pairings. 2. Devaluation of the unconditioned stimulus through association with an aversive stimulus. 3. Testing conditioned properties of the conditioned stimulus. Developmental psychology, the study of systematic changes that occur across the lifespan in humans. Dictator game, an economic game in which a player must choose how much money to give to a second player. Directed social learning, in some cases of social learning, the identity of the demonstrator increases his or her salience for an observing individual. Discrimination, the cognitive process of distinguishing items or events based on one or more distinct features. Disinhibition, the recovery of a conditioned response following extinction when a novel stimulus is presented. Dispersal, movement away from a parent or conspecific population due to a declining habitat, overcrowding, or mate competition. Distress calls, vocalizations emitted by many young mammals when separated from the nest or their mothers. Divided attention, the ability to process simultaneously sensory input from more than one source. Eavesdropping, passive listening by other members of a group. Ecological psychology, a subdiscipline of psychology associated with James J. Gibson, promoting the idea that behavior and cognition can only be understood in the environmental context in which it took place, like optic flow. EEG, ERP, electroencephalography, EEG, is a neuroscience technique in which brain activity is measured along the scalp by multiple electrodes. EEG can measure event-related potentials, ERP, which are brain responses to specific sensory, cognitive, or motor events. Elaboration, the process of adding meaning, images, or other complex information to incoming sensory input such that encoding is enhanced. Elastic demand, changes in the price of an item are inversely related to demand for that item. Emotional contagion, matching another individual's emotional state. Empathetic perspective taking, de Waal's third level of empathy, in which an individual understands others' needs and experiences vicarious emotional arousal. Empathy, the ability to understand the feelings of others. Encoding, the first stage of memory processing, in which incoming information is converted into neural signals that are used for later processing. End-state emulation, a type of social learning in which the actions of the demonstrator are not learned, but the fact that a particular end state can be achieved is learned. Entrainment, the process by which the internal circadian rhythm falls into synchrony with the external day-night cycle. Episodic memory, a subcategory of declarative memory describing knowledge for events in a personal past. Equipotentiality, the idea that associations between different stimuli, responses, and reinforcers could be formed with equal ease. Equivalence classes, sets of stimuli that have been grouped together via experience, such that if one member of an equivalence class becomes discriminative for a given behavior, the other members become discriminative for the same behavior. Ethology, the scientific study of the causes and adaptive value of animal behavior, a subtopic of zoology and biology. Exemplar, a distinct item within a category. Extinction, removal of an unconditioned stimulus that leads to a reduction in responding. Extractive foraging, physically extracting a food source from the environment. False beliefs, The ability to represent the inaccurate belief states of others is often considered a hallmark of mental state attribution, as these beliefs diverge from one's own belief states. Fast mapping. In the study of language development, the ability to connect a new sound and object, e.g., so as to learn a word, with minimal experience. Feature integration theory. A modern version of structuralism, which posits that the elements of sensory input are combined to produce perceptual wholes. Fission-fusion society. A social organization in which individuals merge and separate with larger and smaller groups. Fixed action pattern, FAP. Stereotyped instinctive behaviors that occur in a rigid order and are triggered by assigned stimulus in the external environment. Fixed interval, FI. A reinforcement schedule in which reinforcement is delivered following the first responses that occur after a set period of time. Fixed ratio, FR. A reinforcement schedule in which a set number of responses produces the reinforcer. fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. Free running rhythm, the rhythm of the internal clock when light-dark input from the environment is removed in experimental studies of the circadian rhythm. Frequency coding, a principle of sensory detection describing the relationship between stimulus intensity and firing rate of sensory neurons. As stimulus intensity increases, so does the rate of action potentials, firing. Function, a term in the study of tool use that refers to what an object or tool was made for. Functional categorization, the process of grouping stimuli together based on a shared meaning or association, associative categorization. Functional fixedness, a term used to describe situations in which humans have difficulty ignoring an artifact's original function so as to use it to solve a new problem. Functionally referential, a characteristic of signals that provide information specific to a particular object or event and are responded to by receivers even in the absence of the object or event. Game theory, the study of cooperation and competition among individuals using simulations of interactions. Genotype, an organism's genetic code. Glia, non-neuronal cells in the central nervous system. The functions of glia include supporting and nourishing neurons, guiding neuronal growth during development, and removing debris after neuronal injury or death. Greenbeard gene, a gene that codes for mechanisms that ultimately allow organisms to recognize a fellow carrier of certain genes. Habit learning, stimulus-response learning, responses that are elicited automatically by environmental stimuli and are relatively insensitive to changes in the value of the reinforcer. Habituation, decreased responding to repeated presentation of a stimulus that is often discussed in terms of reflex modification, a type of non-declarative memory. Handicap principle, some costly traits may serve as honest signals of biological fitness. Handling, the time and energy required to extract a consumable food item from its source. Heuristic, in decision-making, a cognitive process that ignores or discounts a portion of available information, thereby saving time and mental resources. An informal rule of thumb. Homing, a type of large-scale navigation that involves returning home after displacement, often from an unfamiliar location. Hyperthymesia, enhanced autobiographical memory. Ideal free distribution model, a theory explaining how conspecifics divide themselves during group foraging. The number of animals aggregating at a particular food patch is proportional to the amount of resources available at that patch. Imitation, a type of social learning in which the observer recognizes the end state and reproduces the specific actions that were used to bring about that state. Imprinting, a particular type of learning in which exposure to specific stimuli or events, usually at a young age, alters behavioral traits of the animal. Impulsivity, preference for a small immediate reward over a large delayed reward. Inclusive fitness, a measure of an individual's fitness that takes into account his or her own offspring, direct fitness, and the offspring of relatives, indirect fitness. Indifference point, the point at which immediate and delayed rewards are equally valued. Individual recognition, a form of social categorization that involves recognition of a specific member of the same species based on individual features and not familiarity. Inelastic demand, changes in the price of an item have relatively little impact on demand for the item. Inequality aversion, a negative reaction to situations in which there is unequal pay for equal work. Innate, developmentally fixed, not the product of conditioning or learning. Instinct, a behavioral pattern that appears in full form the first time it is displayed, even if the organism has no previous experience with the stimuli that elicits this behavior. Internal working models of attachment, cognitive representations of social interactions that are constantly being revised due to experience through development. Interval timing, keeping track of and remembering durations on the order of seconds or minutes. Just noticeable difference, JND, the amount by which two sensory stimuli must differ in order for the difference to be detected. Kinesis, non-directional movement in response to a stimulus. Kin recognition, a form of social categorization that involves recognition of genetic relations. Landmark, a stimulus that has a fixed spatial relationship to a goal location. Latent inhibition, a phenomenon in which prior exposure to a stimulus blocks or retards subsequent conditioning to the stimulus, also called conditioning stimulus pre-exposure effect. Lateral geniculate nucleus, a group of neurons in the thalamus that receives a major projection from visual receptors, the first relay station in visual processing beyond the retina. Launching events, physical events, like those of colliding billiard balls, have a certain motion pattern that yields the perception of causality. Law of effect, Thorndike's idea that responses that produce a satisfying outcome will be repeated, whereas those that produce unsatisfying outcomes will not. Learning, the acquisition of information, measured as the modification of behavior based on past experience. Learning curve, changes in behavior that occur across conditioning trials, either classical or operant, characterized by smaller and smaller increments as the trials progress. Limited signal set, a term used to characterize most animal communication, a relatively small number of signals used in a small number of contexts, e.g., food, aggression, competition, sex, and danger from predators. Linguistics, the scientific study of the nature and structure of human language. Local enhancement, a type of social learning in which one's attention is drawn to a locale, thus facilitating learning. Long-term potentiation, LTP, persistent increase in synaptic strength following high-frequency firing of the presynaptic neurons. Marginal value, the point at which foraging in one patch yields a net energy gain that is lower than the average gain of the habitat. Mark test, an experimental design used to study mirror self-recognition by examining whether participants notice and remove a mark on their body when looking in a mirror. Matching law, a rule that describes choice behavior. The relative rate of responding on one alternative matches the relative rate of reinforcement on that alternative. Mate choice copying, an instance of social learning in which an individual chooses to mate with a conspecific with whom another member of the group has mated. Memory, the mental processes of acquiring and retaining information for later retrieval, measured as the modification of behavior based on past experience. Mental states, feelings, desires, emotions, beliefs, and intentions that are the assumed causes of the behavior. Methodological behaviorism, an experimental approach that involves quantifiable measures of behavioral output, involves tight control of extraneous variables that may affect behavioral measures. Migration, a type of large-scale navigation that involves seasonal movement between spatially distinct habitats. Mimicry, a type of social learning in which an observer learns about a demonstrator's actions without understanding the objects involved or the end state of the action. Mirror neurons, a system of neurons in the premotor cortex that respond to observations of action as well as the production of the same action. Morgan's canon, a term coined by the 19th century, 1800s, British psychologist C. Lloyd Morgan, the principle that animal behavior should not be interpreted in terms of higher cognitive processes when simpler explanations are possible. Mutualism, a term used to describe situations in which unrelated individuals simultaneously benefit from an interaction. Natal homing, large-scale navigation that involves returning to the birthplace to reproduce. Natal philopatry, a behavioral trait of remaining in the vicinity or returning to one's birthplace to breed and rear young. Natural causality, physical causal events in which the generative processes are relatively apparent, e.g., launching events. See arbitrary causality for contrast. Navigation, the process of identifying a specific location regardless of one's current position, divided into small-scale navigation, short-distance travel within familiar territory, and large-scale navigation, long-distance travel often through unfamiliar territory. Negative reinforcement, a positive relationship between a response and an aversive stimulus. Removal of the reinforcer increases responding. Neuroeconomics, the study of how the brain interacts with the environment to enable decision-making, an interdisciplinary endeavor aimed at understanding the neurological underpinnings of decision-making. Cost versus reward. Neurohormone, a hormone secreted in the circulation for systematic effect that can also have a role as a neurotransmitter, e.g. oxytocin. Neuron, a nerve cell. The primary function of neurons is to receive and transmit information in the central nervous system. Nominal scale, a qualitative level of measurement that can contain numbers that serve to differentiate items or that are used as labels. Non-declarative memory, a subcategory of reference memory that does not depend on an awareness or explicit knowledge to be expressed. It's implicit. Unconscious. Object displacement tasks, a methodological technique used to examine object permanence and the ability to track objects through occlusion. Object movement reenactment, a type of emulation characterizing instances in which, through the actions of others, an individual has learned how objects can move. Object permanence, recognizing that objects exist even when they are out of view or imperceptible via scent or sound. Object physics, the regularities in the displacements of objects and their interactions with other objects. Object tracking system, a proposed mechanism that likely underlies small number discrimination and entails a small number of mental indexes for individual objects. Observational conditioning, a type of social learning in which attention may be drawn to a location or an object, e.g. a lever, and an association might be formed between that location or object and reinforcement, e.g. presentation of food. Omission, a negative relationship between a response and an aversive stimulus. Removal of the reinforcer decreases responding. Ontogenetic adaptation, a characteristic that serves an adaptive function at a certain time in development. Operant conditioning, a change in behavior that occurs because the behavior produces a consequence, positive or negative. Operations, procedures on numbers such as addition or subtraction. Optic flow, the movement of elements in a visual scene relative to the observer, a critical component of ecological theories of perception. Ordinal scale, a qualitative level of measurement that contains numbers that are ordered in a rank based on their relative magnitudes. Orientation, an angle measured with respect to a reference direction, the process of taking up a particular bearing with respect to a current position, regardless of the ultimate destination. Oscillators, mechanisms that fluctuate in a rhythmic, sinusoidal manner. Overimitation, faithful imitation of a demonstrator's actions, including extraneous, non-causal actions. Overmatching, a deviation from the matching law in which subjects are more sensitive to reinforcement payoffs than predicted. In concurrent choice paradigms, the relative rate of responding on the lower payoff alternative is lower than the relative payoff provided by that alternative. Overshadowing, a phenomenon in which one stimulus acquires stronger conditioning than a second stimulus when the two are presented in compound conditioning trials. Pacemaker, a hypothetical generator of pulses that are sent to an accumulator within the information processing theory of timing and number. Patches, discrete areas within a habitat containing food that are separated by areas with little or no food. Path integration, a mechanism of small-scale navigation that allows animals to return to a starting location, usually their home, by keeping track of the combined distance and direction traveled on a single journey, also called dead reckoning. Peak procedure, a procedure for examining timing in animals that involves exposing subjects to many trials in which food can be accessed a fixed time after the onset of a stimulus. With experience, target behavior peaks around the fixed time. Perception, the interpretation of sensations, involves processing, organizing, and filtering of sensory information. Perceptual categorization, the process of grouping stimuli together based on shared physical features. Perceptual narrowing, a process by which experiences with certain stimuli results in a system that is tuned to those features, allowing for increased recognition and distinctions within those stimuli as compared to other stimuli. Perceptual priming, facilitated identification of a stimulus as a consequence of prior exposure to the stimulus, a type of non-declarative memory. Periodic timing, a primary type of timing for cyclical activity that occurs during a 24-hour period. Phenotype, an organism's observable traits, both physiological and behavioral. Phenotypic matching, a possible mechanism of kin recognition in which an individual compares a conspecific's phenotype with its own. Phenotypic plasticity, the ability of animals to change behavior to fit changing environments. Pheromone, a chemical released by one animal that is used as a scent signal by another animal, usually a conspecific. Phonemes, a basic unit of speech sound that can be combined with other phonemes to create meaningful units, e.g. morphemes. Place cells, pyramidal neurons in the hippocampus that fire when an animal is in a particular location. Place fields, the spatial area that produces the greatest response in a place cell. Playback experiment, an experimental technique in which pre-recorded vocal signals are played back from concealed speakers. Play markers, specific and highly stereotyped behaviors that can serve to initiate and maintain the play context. Point light displays, visual displays depicting the biological movements of individual joints with single lights, effectively producing an animation of movement. Population coding, a principle of sensory detection describing the relationship between stimulus intensity and the number of sensory neurons firing action potentials. As the stimulus intensity increases, so does the number of firing neurons increase. Positive reinforcement, a positive relationship between a response and an appetitive stimulus. Presentation of the reinforcer increases responding. Precursor behaviors, behaviors observed early in the development of tool use that contain elements of mature tool use. Presynaptic terminal, the swelled tip of axons where a neurotransmitter is released when an action potential arrives. The prisoner's dilemma, game analyzed in game theory that has been used to model the evolution of prosocial behavior. Procedural memory, the process underlying a gradual change in behavior based on feedback, a type of non-declarative memory. Prosimians, primates that split from the common ancestor to monkeys, apes, and humans. Prosopagnosia, a deficit in face recognition with no loss in the ability to identify other objects, may be congenital or acquired. Prototype, the typical or most representative member of a category. Proximate cause, a description of a trait or behavior in terms of its development or its mechanisms. Pseudocategory, a random collection of stimuli that have no obvious cohesive feature. Psychophysics, the study of the relationship between sensations and perceptions, the relationship between the physical properties of a stimulus and the interpretation of that stimulus. Punishment, a negative relationship between a response and an appetitive stimulus. Presentation of the reinforcer decreases responding. Ratio strain, cessation of operant responding with high FR schedules. Receiver, the recipient of a signal in a communicative interaction. Recursion, when applied to language, refers to the unlimited extension that is made possible by embedding clauses within clauses. Redirected aggression, after being threatened by one individual, an individual may redirect his own threatening behaviors to an individual related to the one who originally threatened him. Reference memory, long-term memory, involves encoding, consolidation, and retrieval of information in long-term store. Reinforcement schedule, in operant conditioning, the relationship between responding and the rate of reinforcement delivery. Relational categorization, the process of grouping stimuli together based on the same connection between two or more items, also called rule-based learning. Relative numerosity, an approximate quantity in relation to another quantity. Releaser, see sign stimulus. Reproductive fitness, the contribution to the gene pool that is made by an individual, see also inclusive fitness. Response renewal, reacquisition, recovery of a conditioned response following extinction when extinction is conducted in a novel environment. Retrieval, the third stage of memory processing in which stored information is accessed. Risk sensitivity, variable responses to choice situations involving unpredictable outcomes across time. Rotational bias, a tendency to use geometric relationships in small-scale navigation that leads to systematic errors in locating a goal when environmental cues are rotated. Scalar property, a term used to describe situations in which the variability of responses is proportional to the length of the interval being timed. Search image, a mental representation of a target. Foraging animals scan the environment for stimuli that match the search image. Selective attention, the ability to attend to a limited range of sensory information while actively inhibiting competing input. Self-control, preference for a large delayed reward over a small immediate reward. Semantic memory, a subcategory of declarative memory, which is explicit, describing general knowledge of the world, like facts. Sender, the producer of a signal in a communicative interaction. Sensation, the activation of sensory receptors by physical stimuli in the environment. Sensitization, increased responding to repeated presentation of a stimulus that is often discussed in terms of reflex modification, a type of non-declarative memory, if the intensity is really high. Sensitive period, a period in which experience-dependent manipulations can have profound effects on development, for example, language acquisition before puberty. Sensory bias, enhanced responding to sensory stimuli that are not part of an animal's natural environment and were not part of the natural environment of their ancestors. Sensory drive hypothesis, a theory to explain ecological divergence within a species. When populations occupy new habitats with different sensory environments, natural selection favors adaptations that maximize the effectiveness of intra- and interspecies communication. Sensory exploitation, an explanation for sensory bias, a sensory signal that has an evolutionary advantage in one context has been co-opted in another. Sensory preconditioning, a three-stage experiment. 1. Two neural stimuli, A and B, are presented together. 2. One stimulus, A, is paired with an unconditioned stimulus. 3. The other stimulus B is tested for conditioned responses. Sensory threshold, the minimum level of stimulation that can be detected by each sensory system. Set size signature, a characteristic of small number discrimination such that performance is determined by the size of the arrays. Sexual dimorphism, a systematic difference in a physical trait or behavior between males and females of the same species. Signals, information sent by a sender to a receiver in a communicative interaction. Signature whistle, individual-specific whistles of dolphins. Sign stimulus, the essential feature of a stimulus that is necessary to elicit a response, sometimes called a releaser. Release is a natural instinct. Situational freedom, inherent to human language, a speaker can refer to objects, people, or events that have occurred in the past, are occurring now, or will occur in the future. Social categorization, the process of classifying organisms into groups that include conspecifics versus heterospecifics, kin versus non-kin, and familiar versus unfamiliar conspecifics. A conspecific is a member of the same species, and a heterospecific is a member of a different species. Social facilitation occurs when the mere presence of a conspecific can increase or decrease an individual's arousal, regardless of the conspecific's behavior. Social knowledge, the recognition of individuals and their relationships to one another. Social tolerance, the ability to accept the presence of conspecifics in, for example, a feeding situation. Soma, cell body that contains the nucleus and other structures that aid in cellular metabolism. Somatic marker hypothesis, the idea that decision-making is informed by bodily reactions that are triggered by emotions. Song, species-typical musical vocalizations that are primarily produced during the mating season by males of the order Passeriformes. Speciation, the process by which new species evolve, usually as the result of isolation from the main population. Spontaneous recovery, the reappearance of a conditioned response following extinction. Stimulus enhancement, a type of social learning in which one's attention is drawn to an object or event as a result of the actions, past or present, of others. Stimulus filtering, the process of separating and extracting meaningful, i.e., biologically relevant, information from the abundance and diversity of sensory cues in the environment. Strabismus, a condition in which the visual axes of the two eyes are misaligned, disrupts depth perception and binocular vision. The strange situation test, a procedure used to test attachment between an infant and a caregiver. Structuralism, the idea that perceptions are built from the elements of sensations. Supernormal stimuli, stimuli with exaggerated naturalistic features that elicit greater responses than the natural stimuli on which they are modeled. Suppression ratio, the dependent measure in a classical conditioning test of suppression of lever pressing, calculated as lever presses during the conditioned stimulus divided by lever presses during the conditioned stimulus plus lever presses during an equal period of time preceding the conditioned stimulus. Sustained attention, the ability to focus on one aspect of the environment for extended periods of time. Sympathetic concern, de Waal's second level of empathy, in which emotional contagion is combined with appraisal of the current context, as well as attempts to understand the underlying cause of the other's distress. Sympathy, feelings of concern for others stemming from empathy. Synapse, a narrow gap between the presynaptic terminal and the cell surface of another neuron. Taxis, directional movement in response to a stimulus. Temporal discounting, the tendency for future rewards to decline in value. Temporal generalization, when responses continue for durations that are different yet close to a trained target duration. Teratology, the study of abnormal development, specifically defects that are present at birth, from the Greek roots teratos, monster, and ology, to study. Theory of mind, the ability to recognize that those around you have minds and mental states, like intentions and beliefs, which guide their behavior. Third-party relationship, the relationship between other individuals in which the self is not a principal party. Tool manufacture, modifying objects in the environment to produce tools. Tragedy of the commons, a term referring to situations in which the outcome of the cooperation is publicly available in the sense that individuals who did not take part in the cooperative activities can access the benefits. Transduction, the transfer of physical events in the environment, sound or light waves, pressure on the skin, etc., to electrical signals in the central nervous system. A buildup of electrical signals causes an action potential in the sensory nerves. Trap tube task, an experimental procedure used to examine the ability to understand the causal relationships among a probing tool, a tube, and the food contained within the tube. Triangulation, a term used to characterize experimental procedures that examine transfer of understanding from one task to another, implying some abstraction of the similar causal structure of the two tasks. Two-action test, an experimental procedure developed to study imitation while controlling for emulation by having demonstrators use one of two different actions to achieve an outcome and examining the subsequent action used by their observers. Ultimatum game, an economic game in which a player must choose how much money to give to a second player, who can then choose to accept or reject the offer. Unconditioned response, UR, in classical conditioning, a response that is elicited prior to conditioning. Unconditioned stimulus, US, in classical conditioning, a stimulus that has motivational significance prior to conditioning. Undermatching, a deviation from the matching law in which subjects are less sensitive to reinforcement payoffs than predicted. In concurrent choice paradigms, the relative rate of responding on the lower payoff alternative is higher than the relative payoff provided by that alternative. Ultimate cause, a description of a trait or behavior in terms of its adaptive value. Utility, the subjective value of an outcome. Variable interval, VI, a reinforcement schedule in which reinforcement is delivered following the first responses that occur after an average time interval has elapsed. Variable ratio, VR, a reinforcement schedule in which an average number of responses produces the reinforcer. Vestibular system, sense organs in the inner ear that monitor body rotation and movement in relation to gravity. Vigilance task, a measure of sustained attention in which subjects are required to monitor a particular location and respond when a stimulus is presented in this area. Waggle dance, a movement performed by bees returning to the hive after finding nectar. The movement conveys information as to the direction and distance to the food source. Working memory, the process of maintaining information in short-term store so that it can be used in other cognitive processes. Zugenra, migratory restlessness.